The morning fog clung to the rolling hills of Normandy, wrapping the French countryside in a thick, ghostly veil. German Panzer units rumbled confidently along narrow dirt roads, their steel treads biting into the soil with a relentless, mechanical rhythm. Smoke from their exhaust mingled with the mist, a signal of power and control, but it was a false sense of security. For unseen eyes, hidden in plain sight, tracked their every movement. Inside the armored hulls of the American Sherman tanks, crews sat in tense silence, each man performing his role with calm precision. The radio crackled softly, a heartbeat of invisible communication connecting units spread across the battlefield. Orders were whispered across miles of terrain, coordinated strikes and flanking maneuvers planned in real time. The Germans thought they were the hunters, but in truth they were being guided, maneuvered and outsmarted without even knowing it. Every Sherman crew understood the stakes. One misstep, one missed transmission, and the mission could collapse. Yet there was confidence here, a quiet, almost eerie confidence, born from the knowledge that their radios were unmatched, a secret weapon the Germans had never imagined. As the panzers rumbled past hedgerows and through villages, the Americans waited, invisible and poised. The silence was electric, thick with anticipation, as if the land itself held its breath. Somewhere ahead, the first clash was inevitable, and when it came, the Germans would discover that the battlefield they thought they controlled was already slipping through their fingers, and none of them would ever know why. Behind the quiet, rolling fields of Normandy, far from the rumble of German panzers, another battle was being waged, one of wires, signals, and ingenuity. Long before the first tank crossed the hedgerows, American engineers labored in secret, piecing together what would become the Sherman tank's most formidable hidden advantage: advanced radios. Unlike the bulky, unreliable communication tools used in earlier conflicts, these radios were designed for speed, range, and absolute secrecy. Every frequency was carefully encrypted, every transmission swift and precise. It was a technology built not for the headlines, but for survival, one that would allow the Allies to move like a single, coordinated organism across a battlefield of chaos. In training grounds scattered across England, Sherman crews spent long days and nights learning to speak in a language of clicks, static, and codes. Officers drilled their men relentlessly on coordination, timing, and rapid response. Every order transmitted through those radios could mean the difference between life and death. Crews learned to anticipate each other's movements, almost as if their tanks were extensions of the same mind. By the time they shipped to France, they could maneuver with a precision that seemed impossible, even to themselves. Meanwhile, German panzer officers marched confidently under a very different assumption. Years of combat experience had convinced them that their tanks' coordination, built on strict hierarchy and visual signals, was unmatched. They believed their movements were unpredictable, their strikes devastating. In reality, they were blind to the invisible network threading through the Allied lines, a network that allowed Sherman crews to anticipate their every move. Historical reports from the Normandy campaign show countless moments when this advantage turned the tide. On one misty morning near Carentan, a Sherman unit intercepted German radio chatter detailing a planned ambush. Within minutes, the Americans repositioned, flanking the enemy and turning what should have been a deadly trap into a decisive victory. German commanders were left scrambling, trying to understand how the Allies always seemed one step ahead. They could see the results, but the mechanism, the secret network of radios and skilled operators, remained hidden. The radios themselves were marvels of wartime engineering, small enough to fit inside the cramped Sherman cabins, yet powerful enough to relay commands across miles of rolling terrain. They were equipped with encryption methods that German signal interceptors had not yet cracked. The tank's designs incorporated them seamlessly, with operators learning to multitask under the pressure of combat. While German commanders relied on line-of-sight flags, Prearranged signals or delayed dispatches, American crews could relay orders instantaneously, adjust formations on the fly, and coordinate attacks in perfect synchrony. Training emphasized not just technical skill, but intuition. Crews learned to hear the battlefield through static, to recognize patterns in enemy movement, and to trust the chain of communication that connected every Sherman within a unit. They ran simulations of ambushes, night maneuvers, and coordinated flanking attacks, each exercise pushing the limits of their radio's reach and their own abilities. By the time they rolled onto French soil, every operator, every gunner, every driver was intimately familiar with the rhythm of the tank and the pulse of the network. Contrast this with German assumptions, and the tension becomes clear. Panzer officers, relying on traditional methods, could not fathom a system that seemed to allow the Americans to predict their every action. One commander recounted frustration during the Battle of St. Lo. "We moved with all the discipline of trained soldiers, yet they were always there, striking from directions we had never exposed." He never knew that the Sherman radios had intercepted his orders moments before they reached his subordinate units, allowing the Americans to act as though they had foreknowledge of every maneuver. Even in moments of chaos, the radios maintained clarity. Reports from American crews described the unnerving calm they felt while listening to the static-filled battlefield, directing tanks as if playing a deadly game of chess. Orders were issued, counters were executed, and the Germans were left reacting in real time, unable to regain the initiative. Each successful interception, each coordinated strike, reinforced the psychological advantage that went far beyond mere firepower. And yet, the full story remained invisible. To the Germans, it was a mystery. Their intelligence units struggled to explain why Sherman tanks seemed to materialize in unexpected positions, or why entire formations collapsed despite careful planning. In a war defined by brute force, the invisible edge of communication became a weapon sharper than steel. By the time the first major engagements in Normandy began, Sherman crews were not just tanks on treads, they were nodes in a vast, living network. Each operator, each encrypted message, each flawlessly executed maneuver contributed to a battlefield orchestra the enemy could hear only as noise. The Germans may have believed they controlled the battlefield, but in reality, it was the Americans' unseen advantage, the silent language of radios, that dictated the pace and outcome of every engagement. In the shadowed training camps and behind the fortified lines, the war had already shifted, and the German commanders, confident in their superior coordination, were unaware that the stage had been set against them, that the invisible advantage of the Sherman radios would soon transform every encounter into a nightmare of unpredictability. The sun had barely broken through the fog when the first echoes of combat reverberated across the hedgerows of Normandy. The ground trembled beneath the treads of German Panzer units, their armored silhouettes advancing with disciplined precision. Each tank seemed invincible, each crew confident in their training and firepower. But they were about to discover that appearances can be deceiving. Hidden behind the mist and gentle rises of the countryside, American Sherman tanks waited, their crews tense but controlled. Inside each hull, the radio crackled softly, a lifeline connecting units spread across the battlefield. Orders flowed through the network like water, invisible yet unstoppable. Alpha unit, hold position. Bravo, flank the northern ridge. Reinforcements ETA 2 minutes. Every command was met with acknowledgement, executed with seamless precision. As the panzers rolled forward, they stumbled first into the unexpected. A Sherman platoon, unseen in the hedgerows, opened fire, their shots carefully timed. While the Germans scrambled to respond, American units were already repositioning, guided by the steady pulse of their radios. One Sherman operator called in the precise location of an exposed Panther tank, directing a coordinated strike that eliminated the threat before the Germans could react. The battlefield became a confusing maze for the panzer crews. Orders crossed the lines late, Messages contradicted one another, and German tanks began firing at shadows that moved before they had even seen them. In one moment, the Germans thought they had a clear advantage, only to find themselves trapped in a perfectly orchestrated ambush. Each flanking maneuver, each repositioning of Sherman units, was synchronized to the invisible rhythm of the radio network. Captain Klaus Richter, a Panzer officer with years of frontline experience, felt a cold dread creeping into his chest. "Something is wrong," he muttered to his adjutant. "They know where we are, before we are even there." He studied the battlefield through binoculars, trying to pinpoint the source of the Americans' uncanny accuracy. But nothing visible explained it. No scouts, no artillery markers, nothing. The German forces were reacting to a ghost, a hidden force that seemed to anticipate every movement. Meanwhile, American crews remained eerily calm. Private First Class James Miller, a radio operator in the lead Sherman, relayed updates with precision. Enemy Panther spotted at grid 34B. Alpha, flank east. Bravo, provide cover fire. Moments later, the maneuver was executed flawlessly. The Germans were left disoriented, their disciplined formations crumbling under attacks that seemed to come from all directions. The radios were more than tools. They were extensions of the crew's minds. Operators listened not just for commands, but for the rhythm of battle itself. Static became information, interruptions became signals, and patterns emerged from what seemed like chaos. Each Sherman tank could move as if guided by intuition, yet that intuition was born from the silent, invisible network connecting them all. As the skirmish intensified, the German units attempted to regroup, issuing counter-orders that arrived too late or contradicted one another. Tank commanders shouted into their radios, but the lines were tangled, messages crossed, and panic began to take root. One Panther driver, unsure of his orders, fired prematurely and exposed his flank to a Sherman that had moved silently into position. A single volley later, the tank was disabled and the crew forced to abandon it. Back in the American lines, the crews felt the tension but maintained control. Lieutenant Henry Crawford directed reinforcements to a vulnerable point, coordinating with units hundreds of meters away. "Move in now. Suppress the 88s on the ridge. Keep moving!" Within moments, the coordinated attack was underway, German positions overwhelmed before they could mount an effective defense. Richter's frustration grew with each passing minute. He had anticipated American tactics, relied on experience, and yet nothing he tried seemed to work. The battleground itself appeared to have betrayed him. Shadows shifted, attacks came from unexpected angles, and every attempt to counterattack was anticipated. The fear gnawed at him. What weapon or strategy could allow an opponent to predict his every move? He had no answer. Only the growing realization that the battle was slipping away. By midday, the engagement had transformed from a clash of steel to a battle of strategy and communication. The Shermans, unseen and coordinated through their advanced radios, had turned what should have been a defensive skirmish into a decisive advantage. German forces were scattered, confused, and unable to regroup effectively. The psychological toll was immense. The invisible edge of the Americans' network created a sense of omnipresence, a ghostly precision that left the enemy grasping at shadows. Even as the dust settled and the immediate firefight ended, Richter could not shake the unease. Somewhere in the chaos of the battle, an unseen force had dictated the flow of events. The Germans had been beaten not by brute strength or superior firepower, but by something intangible, a silent advantage they could neither see nor understand. And in the quiet aftermath, as Sherman crews regrouped and reported their success over the crackling radios, the secret remained intact. To the Germans, the battle had ended mysteriously. To the Americans, it was a calculated victory, orchestrated by skill, preparation, and the invisible pulse of technology that would continue to haunt the enemy in every encounter to come. The morning sun had barely risen over the scarred fields of Normandy, yet in a fortified command post tucked behind the German lines, tension was thick enough to choke the air. Maps lay strewn across tables, marked with jagged red lines tracing failed maneuvers and unexpected Allied strikes. Officers moved quickly, their faces tight with frustration. Nothing about the battlefield seemed to make sense. Entire panzer divisions had faltered, retreating from positions they believed were secure. How could a force they vastly outgunned anticipate every move, exploit every weakness, and vanish before a counterstrike could land? Major Klaus Richter stood at the center of the room, his eyes scanning reports as though sheer concentration could make them reveal their secrets. He had faced countless battles, confronted cunning opponents, and emerged victorious time and time again. Yet here in the heart of France he felt powerless. Repeatedly, American Sherman units executed maneuvers that should have been impossible to coordinate. Blanks were struck before the Germans even knew they were exposed. Artillery fire was redirected to cover retreats they hadn't planned. Something unseen was orchestrating the chaos, and for the first time, Richter could not comprehend it. The intelligence officers pored over intercepted communications, attempting to trace the source. German signal units had captured fragments of radio chatter, but they were garbled, cryptic, and seemingly meaningless. Standard codes had been broken, but the Americans were using a level of encryption that rendered traditional interception useless. Radar screens, once trusted to detect armored movements, revealed nothing. The Allies moved silently, invisibly, coordinated in a way that no German technology could anticipate. "I've seen tanks maneuver," Richter muttered under his breath, as if they were connected by thought itself. "How—" His voice trailed off. The officers around him exchanged grim looks. They had relied on discipline, precision, and superior firepower. Their doctrine demanded control of the battlefield through visibility and command hierarchies. Now none of that mattered. Each failed plan reinforced the Americans' invisible dominance, and every new report was worse than the last. A signal officer, young and tense, approached with a stack of intercepted messages. "Major, these are the transmissions we captured overnight. We attempted decryption, but it's unlike anything we've seen. Frequencies change constantly, encryption rotates too quickly to follow. They're communicating in real time across multiple units, without revealing their positions." Richter pinched the bridge of his nose. "They are. Everywhere," he said, the realization sinking in. "Everywhere at once, yet nowhere we can reach. They know our positions before we even know our own." The room fell silent, the weight of impossibility pressing down on every officer. Historically, German forces had relied heavily on visual coordination, flag signals, hand gestures, and prearranged schedules. Signal interception was attempted through radio taps and listening posts. But the Allies' use of advanced technology, including long-range secure radios, had created a communication network beyond the enemy's comprehension. The American systems allowed units separated by miles to act in perfect synchrony, their actions almost preternaturally timed. Where German intelligence sought patterns, there were none to find, only the smooth, invisible orchestration of the Shermans. Desperation began to creep in. Panzer units were instructed to hold positions they no longer understood. Counterattacks were issued with uncertain timing. Every movement seemed anticipated, every ambush countered before it could unfold. Richter's fingers drummed against the table as he tried to envision a scenario in which his forces could regain control. Each failure gnawed at his confidence. Each unexplained maneuver by the Americans eroded the certainty of victory he had always carried like armor. The suspense built with every intercepted transmission and battlefield report. In one particular engagement near Carentan, German units had prepared a counter-offensive, concentrating tanks and artillery along a predicted path of American advance. Yet the Shermans struck from an unexpected angle, flanking the German positions in perfect coordination. By the time the Panzers realized the danger, it was too late. Shermans had vanished behind hedgerows, leaving destruction in their wake and no trace of the path they had taken. Richter could feel the walls closing in. Every attempt to decode the Americans' advantage was met with failure. Officers debated the possibility of spies or traitors, yet no evidence emerged. Could a machine alone orchestrate such precision? Were the Americans anticipating their every move by sheer cunning? The truth was both simpler and more terrifying, a combination of superior technology, disciplined crews, and invisible communication had given the Allies an edge they could not see, touch, or counter. By late afternoon, Richter ordered a halt to offensive operations. His commanders were exhausted, demoralized by uncertainty. The battlefield, once a canvas they had thought they controlled, now belonged to an enemy they could not track. The Germans had superior firepower, superior numbers in some sectors, and yet it was rendered irrelevant by a force they had never imagined. Sherman crews guided by invisible radios, anticipating, coordinating, and striking with a precision no human intuition could match. As night fell over the fields, Richter stood alone at the edge of the command post, staring across the darkened landscape. Somewhere out there, American tanks moved as one, a silent force connected by a technology that had rewritten the rules of engagement. The realization struck him with a cold finality. The Germans were not losing because of mistakes or luck. They were losing because the battlefield itself had changed, and they had never seen the invisible hand that guided their defeat. In the shadows, the Shermans waited, poised and silent, their crews connected, listening and ready. The Germans had begun to suspect, but suspicion alone could not save them. The turning point was approaching, the moment when the secret of the radios would prove decisive and the invisible advantage would become undeniable. The morning mist of Normandy had barely lifted when chaos erupted across the battlefield. German Panzer units, once disciplined and precise, now staggered in confusion, their formations fractured and their lines vulnerable. Orders shouted from one tank to another often went unheard, garbled by static or delay. Conflicting commands created hesitation. Hesitation created openings. And in those openings, American Sherman tanks struck with relentless precision. Inside one Sherman, Sergeant William Hayes gripped the radio handset, his knuckles white. The crackle of transmissions was steady and reassuring. Alpha unit, flank west. Bravo, suppress the ridge artillery. Move now, he glanced at his gunner and driver. Their eyes met, unspoken understanding passing between them. Every man knew his role. Every move had been rehearsed countless times in training. They were part of a network, an invisible organism moving as one across the battlefield. A few hundred meters away, a panzer crew struggled to regroup. Lieutenant Dieter Klein shouted into his radio, trying to coordinate an attack, but static answered him. Orders conflicted with those from neighboring units. One tank turned left when it should have advanced. Another held position when it should have fired. German commanders were now reacting, not commanding. Their superiority in firepower meant nothing when they could not communicate, could not anticipate, could not see the invisible threads guiding the enemy. Hayes's Sherman pressed forward, slipping through a hedgerow with uncanny timing. From behind, another Sherman emerged simultaneously on the enemy's flank, its gunner taking precise aim at a Panther's exposed rear. The Germans, panicked and disoriented, had no idea how these maneuvers were being coordinated. To them, it seemed as though the Shermans were everywhere at once, a force moving faster than sight, faster than logic. Private First Class Marcus Diaz, operating the loader, felt his stomach knot as shells whistled past the turret. Every successful strike, every destroyed enemy tank, was accompanied by a heartbeat of tension. Victory had a cost. Fear, adrenaline, and the constant awareness that a single misstep could be fatal. But he trusted the radio, trusted the unseen network guiding them. It was this connection, invisible and precise, that turned panic into control. In another sector, Captain Klaus Richter's attempts to rally his troops were failing. His voice, hoarse from shouting, carried over broken radios and misaligned commands. Tanks collided with each other in narrow fields. Artillery units fired into empty hedgerows. The psychological toll was immense. German crews, trained to execute orders flawlessly, now hesitated, confused and terrified by the unpredictable precision of their opponents. The battlefield itself had become an enemy, Meanwhile, American Shermans exploited every lapse. Reinforcements were directed instantly to weak points. Suppressive fire kept enemy heads down, while flanking maneuvers collapsed German formations. The radios allowed the Americans to anticipate threats, to communicate casualties, and reposition units in real time. Each successful coordination built momentum, a rising tide of control that contrasted sharply with the disorder engulfing the German lines. Hayes' tank moved with a rhythm almost preternatural, guided by static and clicks. He relayed a report. Panther down, North Ridge secured. Request Bravo to converge on eastern flank. Within moments, the order was executed. Another Panther, another obstacle, vanished as if it had never existed. Around him, Sherman crews experienced the strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. Alive, aware, connected, unstoppable. The climax of confusion arrived as Richter watched from a hilltop observation post. His battalion was in disarray. Tanks were lost and crews scattered. The Americans struck simultaneously from multiple angles, a coordinated symphony of destruction that left little chance for counteraction. He realized then, with grim clarity, that no human cunning alone had allowed this to happen. The Sherman's invisible advantage, the radios, had turned training, teamwork and technology into a weapon far more powerful than mere steel. Yet, even amid triumph, American crews felt the weight of responsibility. Corporal James Miller, radio operator for the lead Sherman, glanced at his unit. Faces streaked with mud and sweat, eyes wide from adrenaline, all tuned to the same invisible pulse. Every movement carried risk. Every success was hard-won. They were not invincible, but in the orchestration of their network, they were a force the enemy could neither predict nor resist. By midday, the German forces were in full retreat, their lines shattered, morale shattered, confidence shattered. Sherman crews maintained formation, continuing to communicate, coordinate, and pursue. Each successful strike reinforced the reality of the advantage that had remained invisible for so long. The battlefield, once a domain of raw power, had been transformed into a contest of information, timing, and connection. The aftermath left a haunting silence. German survivors stumbled back, disoriented and shaken, unable to comprehend the force that had outmaneuvered them. Richter's mind replayed the events again and again, searching for a pattern, a flaw, a clue, but found none. The Shermans had moved as if guided by an invisible hand, a network of radios giving them sight, voice, and timing the enemy could never match. On the American side, crews regrouped, exchanging quiet words of relief and fatigue. They knew what they had accomplished was more than victory. It was mastery over chaos, a triumph of preparation, skill, and communication. And as they moved toward the next objective, the silent advantage that had carried them through the battlefield remained intact, a decisive edge the enemy could neither touch nor see. In those harrowing hours, the Sherman tanks proved not only their firepower, but the irreplaceable value of connection, coordination, and invisible advantage. The Germans had been unprepared for the rhythm of the Shermans, and in that gap, the tide of battle had turned irrevocably. Chaos reigned in their ranks, while precision and strategy ruled the Americans. The turning point was complete. The silent advantage had spoken, and the battlefield had answered. By late afternoon, the battlefield had quieted, but the echoes of destruction still lingered in the smoke-filled air. German Panzer units, once disciplined and relentless, were now scattered, retreating toward fallback positions. Tanks lay overturned in shattered hedgerows. Artillery crews abandoned their posts, and officers struggled to restore order among the disoriented soldiers. The retreat was chaotic, a slow-motion collapse, as the full weight of the Americans' unseen advantage became painfully clear. Captain Klaus Richter surveyed the remnants of his forces from a ridge, his mind heavy with disbelief. The superior firepower and training of his units had meant little against an enemy operating with precision he could neither anticipate nor counter. Every misstep, every exposed flank, every lost tank was a reminder of a hidden network dictating the flow of battle. The Shermans had moved with an almost supernatural coordination, guided by radios that allowed them to act as one cohesive force. And now, the Germans were paying the price. Across the battlefield, Sherman crews regrouped seamlessly. Lieutenant Henry Crawford relayed status updates over the radio. Alpha secured, Bravo covering Eastern Ridge. All units proceed to next objective. Maintain communication. Even amid exhaustion, the crews remained alert, their efficiency ensuring no opportunity was wasted. Reinforcements were repositioned, damaged tanks accounted for, and remaining German positions monitored in real time. The invisible network that had carried them through chaos continued to function flawlessly. Private James Miller, leaning against the turret after hours of constant engagement, reflected quietly, "We didn't just fight them. We knew them. Every move, every weak point, they never even realized we were there until it was too late." The words lingered, a mix of awe and grim satisfaction. Meanwhile, Richter's officers debated what had gone wrong. Some argued for better reconnaissance, others for faster responses, but all recognized the truth. The Americans' advantage had been beyond conventional tactics. The battle had been won not through brute force alone, but through intelligence, preparation, and a technology the Germans had never anticipated. As the sun sank behind the horizon, both sides felt the weight of the day. One had witnessed an invisible force shaping the course of history. The other had been undone by it, and in that silent, tense twilight, the turning tide of the battle and of the war was unmistakably clear. The fields of Normandy were quiet now, the battle's echoes fading into memory. The hedgerows were scarred, the ground littered with remnants of steel and fire, yet amid the destruction, a deeper story remained, one invisible to the enemy, yet decisive in the shaping of history. The Sherman tanks, their crews weary but unbroken, had not only survived the chaos, they had transformed it into triumph. And the secret behind their success was something the Germans would never see coming, the radios that connected them, guiding their every move with silent precision. Inside the lead Sherman, Sergeant William Hayes allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind fatigue and awe. "We were lucky," he whispered, though luck alone could not account for the seamless coordination that had carried them through fire and chaos. No, it wasn't luck. It was training. It was knowing your crew, trusting the radio, and trusting that the others are doing the same. Around him, other crew members nodded silently, exhausted smiles crossing their faces. Every maneuver, every flanking strike, every perfectly timed salvo had relied on the invisible bond formed by their communications. Historians would later note that the advanced radios in Sherman tanks were among the most influential innovations of the European campaign. They allowed Allied forces to coordinate attacks over vast distances, anticipate enemy movements, and respond instantly to unfolding threats. Where German commanders relied on rigid hierarchies and visual signals, Sherman crews operated as a single unified entity, guided by the pulse of technology and human skill. Battles were won not just by shells and armor, but by the speed of information, the clarity of communication, and the human minds that interpreted it. Meanwhile, across the retreating lines, German soldiers trudged back to regroup. They had fought bravely, with training and discipline honed over years, yet none understood why the Americans had seemed to anticipate their every move. Their eyes scanned the battlefield, searching for evidence, for the explanation behind their defeat, but there was none. To them, the Shermans had been ghosts, striking with precision from directions they could neither predict nor comprehend. Every loss, every disrupted formation, every failed counterattack had been dictated by something invisible, and that secret would remain hidden from them forever. As night fell over the scarred countryside, the Sherman crews continued their advance, connected and coordinated, the radios still whispering across the miles. There was exhaustion, yes, and relief, and an almost surreal sense of accomplishment. They had survived, triumphed, and in the process demonstrated that unseen technology, combined with human skill and courage, could shape the outcome of a war. And so, the story of the radios, the quiet, invisible force that had outmaneuvered Germany's best, remained largely unknown to those who had been defeated by it. For the Germans, the battlefield had been a mystery, a series of improbable defeats they could neither explain nor anticipate. For the Americans, it was a testament to preparation, teamwork, and the silent advantage that had turned chaos into victory. In the end, the truth lingered in the misted fields of Normandy. German troops had never known they were being outwitted, never realized that every step, every misstep, had been guided by an unseen hand. And in that unseen advantage lay the quiet power of strategy, ingenuity, and human determination, the secrets that had won the war.